San Antonio TX, the city that never sleeps, peacefully. Chapter 1. The Whispering Shadows. San Antonio, known for its rich history and vibrant culture, hides a darker secret beneath its lively streets and historic landmarks. Tourists flock to the Alamo, but few realize that something sinister lurks just beyond the edge of the city's bright lights. The city, with its mix of old and new, has become a haven for those who live in the shadows, where nightmares seep into reality. One night, Maria Alvarez was driving home after a late shift at the hospital. The city's warm, humid air felt heavy as she rolled down her windows, hoping the cool breeze would help her stay awake. The road ahead was eerily empty, a stark contrast to the bustling streets she was used to. As she approached an intersection, she noticed a figure standing in the middle of the road, barely illuminated by her headlights. Instinctively, she slowed down, squinting to get a better look. The figure appeared to be a woman dressed in an old-fashioned white gown, her long black hair cascading down her back. Something about her felt wrong, too still, too silent. Maria's heart raced as she inched closer, but before she could react, the figure vanished, leaving only the echo of a distant cry. Startled, Maria sped away, her hands trembling on the wheel. But as she glanced in the rearview mirror, she saw the woman again, now standing on the side of the road, her eyes glowing with a faint, unnatural light. Maria's breath caught in her throat, and she could have sworn she heard a soft, mournful whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Help me." Chapter 2. The Alamo's Darkest Hour. San Antonio's history is steeped in blood, none more so than at the Alamo. While visitors pay homage to the fallen heroes, few are aware of the restless spirits that still linger within its walls. The legend goes that during the battle, a group of soldiers took refuge in the church, only to be brutally massacred as they prayed for their lives. Their blood soaked the ground, and their anguished screams echoed through the ages. Years later, a security guard named Luis, who had worked the night shift at the Alamo for over a decade, began to notice strange occurrences. At first, it was just faint noises, footsteps in the empty halls, hushed voices in the dead of night. But as time passed, the activity grew more intense. One night, Luis was making his rounds when he heard the unmistakable sound of chanting. It was faint at first, but as he moved closer to the chapel, the voices grew louder, more desperate. He felt a chill run down his spine as he reached the door, his hand trembling as he pushed it open. Inside, the chapel was dark, but the chanting continued, echoing off the stone walls. Luis flicked on his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. What he saw made his blood run cold. Shadows moved across the walls, forming the shapes of men in old military uniforms, their faces twisted in agony. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and blood. Suddenly, the chanting stopped and the room fell silent. Luis stood frozen, unable to move as a figure stepped forward from the darkness, a soldier with a bullet wound in his chest, his eyes filled with sorrow. The ghostly figure raised a hand, pointing directly at Luis, and whispered, "Remember us." Luis fled, never to return. The next morning, his co-workers found him sitting on the steps outside, pale and shaking, unable to speak of what he had seen. Chapter 3. The River Walk's Drowning Souls. The San Antonio River Walk is a popular destination, with its charming cafes, picturesque bridges, and tranquil waters. But beneath its serene surface lies a darker tale. For centuries, the river has claimed the lives of those who dared to cross it under the wrong circumstances. Some say the waters are cursed, haunted by the souls of the drowned, who now seek to drag others into their watery graves. One evening, a young couple, Jake and Emily, decided to take a romantic stroll along the river walk. The night was warm, and the moonlight shimmered on the water's surface, creating an almost ethereal glow. They laughed and talked, enjoying each other's company, unaware of the danger that lurked nearby. As they walked along the edge of the river, Emily noticed something strange, a figure floating just beneath the surface. She stopped, peering closer, and realized with horror that it was the pale face of a woman, her eyes wide open and staring directly at her. Before Emily could react, the figure vanished, replaced by dark, swirling water. A cold breeze swept through the air, and the once calm river began to churn violently. Jake grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her away from the edge, but it was too late. The water surged, and a pair of ghostly hands emerged, grasping at Emily's ankles. Emily screamed as she was pulled towards the river, her nails digging into the ground as she struggled to hold on. Jake fought to pull her back, but the force was too strong. Just as Emily felt herself slipping, the hands suddenly released her, and the water returned to its calm state as if nothing had happened. Shaken, the couple fled the river walk, but they were haunted by the memory of the woman's face and the feeling that something sinister had followed them home. Chapter 4. The Hotel's Unwanted Guests. San Antonio is home to many historic hotels, each with its own stories to tell. But none are as terrifying as the tales that come from the old Menger Hotel, where guests have reported encounters with spirits that refuse to leave. One such guest was a traveling salesman named George, who checked into the hotel on a quiet Wednesday night. Exhausted from a long day of meetings, he was looking forward to a good night's sleep. But from the moment he stepped into his room, he felt an overwhelming sense of unease. The room was cold, despite the warm Texas weather, and the air was thick with the smell of cigar smoke, though no one had smoked there in years. As George unpacked, he heard the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway, followed by a soft knock on the door. Thinking it was room service, George opened the door, but no one was there. Confused, he shut the door and went back to his bed, only to hear the knock again, this time louder. Annoyed, he flung the door open, but once again, the hallway was empty. That night, George was awoken by the sound of voices in his room. He sat up, his heart pounding, and saw a group of men gathered around a table, playing cards. They were dressed in old-fashioned suits, their faces obscured by the thick smoke that filled the room. One of the men looked up, his eyes meeting George's, and smiled, a cold, cruel smile. The next morning, George checked out of the hotel, vowing never to return. But as he walked out of the lobby, he caught a glimpse of the same man from his dream, standing by the front desk, watching him leave with that same sinister smile. Chapter 5. The Curse of La Llorona. San Antonio, like much of the Southwest, has its own version of the legend of La Llorona, the Weeping Woman. It's said that she roams the city's streets and rivers, searching for her lost children, her cries echoing through the night. Maria, a single mother living in the outskirts of San Antonio, had heard the stories growing up, but she never believed them. Until the night she heard the cries outside her window. It was a soft, mournful wail, carried by the wind. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the wind, but then the cries grew louder, more desperate. Fear gripped her as she rushed to her children's room, only to find them sound asleep. But the cries continued, growing closer and closer. Maria peered out the window and saw a figure standing by the riverbank, dressed in white, her long hair blowing in the wind. The woman turned, revealing a face twisted in sorrow, her eyes filled with tears. "My children, where are my children?" she sobbed, her voice filled with despair. Terrified, Maria slammed the window shut and pulled her children close, praying for the woman to go away. But the cries continued throughout the night, and when morning came, Maria found wet footprints leading from the river to her door. From that night on, Maria kept a vigil, never letting her children out of her sight. But the cries of La Llorona haunted her, a constant reminder of the curse that lingered over the city of San Antonio. Chapter 6. The Devil's Bridge. In the outskirts of San Antonio lies an old forgotten bridge known to locals as the Devil's Bridge. It was once a busy thoroughfare, but over the years it fell into disrepair, avoided by all except those seeking thrills and ghost stories. The bridge earned its name from the many strange occurrences and unexplained deaths that happened there, with rumors that it was cursed by a pact with the devil himself. One summer evening, a group of teenagers decided to test their courage by visiting the bridge. Armed with flashlights and a Ouija board, they laughed nervously as they made their way to the old structure, the wooden planks creaking beneath their feet. "Let's see if the devil really does show up," one of them joked, but his voice trembled slightly as he spoke. They set up the Ouija board in the middle of the bridge, the wind howling through the trees as they began the session. At first, nothing happened. The planchette moved slowly across the board, spelling out nonsense words that only heightened their nervous laughter. But then the air grew colder, and the laughter died in their throats as the planchette began to move on its own, faster and more forceful, spelling out a single word, "Leave." The group fell silent, their breath visible in the cold air as they stared at the board in shock. Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to shake, and the sound of footsteps echoed on the bridge, though no one was there. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until it sounded like someone or something was running straight toward them. Panicking, they scrambled to their feet and bolted for the other side of the bridge. But as they ran, the footsteps followed, matching their pace, growing louder and louder. One of the boys, Tim, tripped and fell, and when he looked up, he saw a pair of glowing red eyes staring down at him from the darkness. He screamed as an icy hand grabbed his ankle, pulling him towards the edge of the bridge. His friends tried to help, but it was as if an invisible force was holding them back. Just as Tim was about to be dragged over the side, the grip loosened and the footsteps stopped. Terrified, the group fled back to their cars, vowing never to return. But Tim was never the same. He became withdrawn, haunted by nightmares of the bridge and the red-eyed creature that had tried to pull him into the abyss. Despite moving away from San Antonio, he could still hear the footsteps in the dead of night, a constant reminder that the Devil's Bridge was not a place to be trifled with. Chapter 7. The Haunted Hospital. Not far from the heart of San Antonio stands an old hospital, abandoned for decades. The building, once a place of healing, has become a haven for spirits that refuse to leave. The locals call it the Haunted Hospital, a place where the living and the dead coexist in uneasy silence. For years, urban explorers and thrill-seekers have ventured into the hospital, hoping to catch a glimpse of the paranormal. But few have dared to stay long, driven out by the overwhelming sense of dread that permeates the air. One such explorer, a man named Alex, had always been fascinated by the supernatural. He had heard the stories about the hospital, the disembodied voices, the flickering lights, the shadows that moved on their own, and decided to see for himself. Armed with a camera and a flashlight, Alex entered the hospital late one night, the floorboards creaking under his weight as he made his way through the dark, empty halls. The air was stale, thick with the scent of decay, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of dripping water. As he explored the building, Alex began to feel as though he was being watched. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, and he could hear faint whispers, just out of earshot. He tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself it was just his imagination, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. In one of the rooms, he found an old surgical table, rusted and covered in dust. As he approached, his flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, he saw the outline of a figure standing by the table, a doctor in a blood-stained coat, his face obscured by shadow. Alex blinked, and the figure was gone. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. He backed away, his heart pounding, and turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. Panicking, Alex tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers became a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, their words incomprehensible but filled with anger and despair. The room grew darker, the shadows closing in around him, and the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Just as Alex thought he was about to be consumed by the darkness, the door flew open, and he stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. The whispers ceased, and the air felt lighter, but the fear remained. He didn't stop running until he was outside, the hospital looming behind him like a dark sentinel. He never spoke of what he had seen, but the footage he captured on his camera told a chilling tale, a faint, ghostly figure standing by the surgical table, staring directly at the lens with empty, hollow eyes. Chapter 8. The Ghostly Children of Espada Park. Espada Park, with its scenic trails and historic missions, is a popular spot for families in San Antonio. But as beautiful as the park is during the day, it holds a tragic secret that reveals itself only at night. According to legend, a group of children from a nearby orphanage drowned in the San Antonio River many years ago. The river, swollen from a recent storm, swept them away as they played by the water's edge, their screams lost in the howling wind. Their bodies were never recovered, and since then, their spirits have been seen wandering the park, searching for their lost companions. One evening, a woman named Linda decided to take a walk through the park, hoping to clear her mind after a stressful day. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the trees, and the park was peaceful, with only the sound of birds and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. As she walked along the riverbank, Linda heard the faint sound of children laughing. She smiled, thinking it was a group of kids playing nearby, but when she looked around, she saw no one. The laughter continued, growing louder and more echoing, as if it were coming from all directions at once. Confused, Linda walked towards the sound, her footsteps crunching on the gravel path. As she approached a small clearing, she saw them, a group of children, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, standing by the water's edge. They were holding hands, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear. Linda's heart skipped a beat as she realized the children were not playing, but staring at something in the water. She followed their gaze and saw a dark figure emerging from the river, its form shifting and changing like smoke. The children began to cry, their voices filled with terror, as the figure reached out towards them. Terrified, Linda turned to run, but the path seemed to stretch out before her, the trees closing in and blocking her way. The air grew colder, and the sound of the river roared in her ears, drowning out her own frantic heartbeat. Suddenly, the laughter stopped, and the park fell silent. Linda turned back to see the children were gone, replaced by a thick, rolling fog that covered the ground like a shroud. The dark figure was nowhere to be seen, but the sense of dread lingered, pressing down on her like a heavy weight. She ran back to her car, her breath coming in short gasps, and as she drove away, she caught one last glimpse of the river in her rearview mirror. There, standing on the bank, was one of the children, watching her leave with a sad, sorrowful expression, his small hand raised in a silent plea for help. Linda never returned to Espada Park, but the memory of the ghostly children haunted her dreams for years to come, a reminder that some spirits can never find peace. Chapter 9. The Demon of Donkey Lady Bridge. San Antonio's folklore is steeped in tales of supernatural beings, but few are as terrifying as the legend of the Donkey Lady. The story goes that many years ago, a woman living on a farm near Elm Creek was horribly disfigured in a fire set by vengeful townsfolk. Her face was said to be twisted and elongated, resembling that of a donkey, and her hands were burned to resemble hooves. Driven mad by her appearance and the cruelty of those who harmed her, she now haunts the bridge that spans the creek, seeking revenge on anyone who dares to cross it at night. One autumn night, a group of friends decided to visit Donkey Lady Bridge, curious to see if the legends were true. They drove out to the remote location, the full moon casting eerie shadows across the landscape. The bridge was old and rickety, its wooden planks creaking underfoot as they cautiously approached. "Do you really think she'll show up?" one of them asked, his voice tinged with nervous laughter. They all shrugged it off, but an uneasy silence fell over the group as they reached the center of the bridge. Suddenly, the air grew thick and the temperature dropped. The night, which had been filled with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves, became deathly quiet. Then, from the darkness, they heard it, a faint, agonized braying like the cry of a wounded animal. The sound sent chills down their spines, and they backed away, but it was too late. From the shadows, a figure emerged, hobbling on twisted legs. The moonlight revealed a hideous face, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light, and its mouth twisted into a snarl. The Donkey Lady had found them. The group screamed and ran, but the creature was faster. She let out a terrible screech, her hooves pounding on the wooden planks as she gave chase. One by one, the friends were caught, their screams echoing in the night as the Donkey Lady exacted her vengeance. By morning, only one of them was found, wandering aimlessly along the road, his clothes torn and his face pale with terror. He could barely speak, but the authorities pieced together what little he could say. She wouldn't stop. Those eyes. The bridge was closed off after that night, but locals still whisper about the Donkey Lady, warning others to stay far away from the cursed spot. Some say that if you drive near the bridge at night, you can still hear her cries in the distance, a chilling reminder that the legend is far from dead. Chapter 10. The Phantom Train of Huebner Road. In the quiet outskirts of San Antonio lies Huebner Road, a place with a tragic past and a ghostly presence that lingers in the dead of night. Decades ago, a train derailed on this stretch of track, killing many of its passengers. The cause of the accident was never fully determined, but some believe it was an act of sabotage or a dark omen. Since that day, the ghostly train has been seen speeding down the tracks, doomed to repeat its final journey. One foggy night, a man named Carl was driving home along Huebner Road after a late shift. The road was shrouded in mist, and the world around him felt strangely muffled, as if he were the only person left in the world. He knew the road well, but as he approached the old train crossing, his car stalled suddenly, its engine cutting out without warning. Carl cursed under his breath and tried to restart the car, but it wouldn't turn over. The mist thickened around him, and in the distance he heard the faint sound of a train whistle. He frowned, knowing that the tracks had been abandoned for years. As the whistle grew louder, the ground began to vibrate, and Carl's heart raced. He turned to look down the tracks and saw a train approaching, its lights piercing through the fog. But something was wrong. There was no sound of wheels on the tracks, no chugging of an engine, just the eerie whistle and the looming shadow of the train. Panicking, Carl tried the ignition again, but the car remained dead. The train was almost upon him now, its headlights blinding. In desperation, he flung open the door and jumped out, rolling to the side just as the train barreled through the crossing. Carl lay on the ground, his heart pounding in his chest, but when he looked up, the train was gone. There were no tracks, no sign that it had ever been there, just the silence of the night and the mist swirling around him. He scrambled to his feet and ran back to his car, which, to his astonishment, started up immediately. Shaking, he drove away as fast as he could, never looking back. Carl later learned that he wasn't the first to experience the phantom train. Others had reported similar encounters, with some even claiming to have seen the ghostly passengers staring out of the windows, their faces pale and expressionless, trapped in a never-ending journey to nowhere. Chapter 11. The Screams of the San Fernando Cathedral. The San Fernando Cathedral, one of the oldest cathedrals in the United States, stands in the heart of San Antonio. It is a place of worship and reflection, but also a site where the past refuses to rest. The cathedral's history is marked by tragedy, including a devastating fire in the 1800s that claimed many lives. Since then, strange occurrences have plagued the building, and it's said that the spirits of the dead still linger within its walls. One evening, a priest named Father Duan was locking up the cathedral after evening mass. The last of the parishioners had gone, and the cathedral was quiet, its vast interior dimly lit by the flickering candles. Father Duan had always felt a deep sense of peace in the cathedral, but that night something felt different, oppressive, as if the very air was thick with sorrow. As he made his way down the aisle, he heard it, a faint, distant scream, so soft he almost thought he had imagined it. He paused, listening, but the sound didn't come again. Shaking his head, he continued towards the door, but the scream returned, louder this time, echoing through the empty cathedral. Father Duan's heart pounded as he turned to look behind him. The cathedral was empty, but the screams continued, growing more desperate, more anguished. He crossed himself, praying for the souls of the departed, but the cries only intensified, reverberating off the stone walls. Suddenly, the candles lining the altar went out, plunging the cathedral into darkness. Father Duan stumbled back, his hand grasping for the crucifix around his neck. The air grew colder, and the screams were joined by the sound of crying, many voices, all blending together in a chorus of despair. The priest felt a presence behind him, and when he turned, he saw them, shadowy figures moving in the darkness, their faces twisted in agony. They reached out to him, their hands cold as ice, their eyes filled with sorrow and rage. Father Duan fell to his knees, praying fervently, but the spirits would not be appeased. The next morning, the cathedral's caretaker found Father Duan unconscious on the floor, the candles mysteriously relit around him. He was taken to the hospital, but he never spoke of what he had seen, and he refused to enter the cathedral again. The screams have never ceased, and those who visit the San Fernando Cathedral at night often report feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness, as if the very walls are weeping for the souls that were lost. The spirits of the cathedral are trapped, their anguish echoing through the ages, a haunting reminder that some wounds never heal. Chapter 12. The Ghosts of the Menger Hotel. The Menger Hotel, one of the oldest and most historic hotels in San Antonio, has long been rumored to be haunted. Over the years, guests have reported countless encounters with spirits, from the playful to the terrifying. But none are as persistent as the ghost of a chambermaid named Sally White, who was brutally murdered by her husband in the hotel in 1876. Solly's story is a tragic one. After a violent altercation with her husband, she sought refuge at the hotel, where she worked as a chambermaid. Her husband, consumed by jealousy and rage, tracked her down and attacked her, leaving her mortally wounded. Solly died from her injuries 2 days later, and since then, her spirit has been seen wandering the halls of the hotel, continuing her duties even in death. One night, a guest named Margaret checked into the Menger Hotel, unaware of its haunted reputation. She was staying in one of the older rooms, a beautifully furnished suite with antique decor. Exhausted from her travels, she fell asleep quickly, only to be awoken in the middle of the night by the sound of someone moving about the room. Startled, Margaret sat up and saw a figure standing by the bed, a woman dressed in a long, old-fashioned maid's uniform. The woman was tidying the room, smoothing out the bedspread and arranging the pillows with practiced care. At first, Margaret thought it was just a hotel staff member, but as she blinked and rubbed her eyes, the figure began to fade, becoming translucent. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she realized she was seeing a ghost. The maid turned to look at her, her expression sad but peaceful. "Rest well, miss," she said softly, before disappearing completely. The next morning, Margaret mentioned the incident to the front desk, expecting them to dismiss it as a dream. But the clerk simply nodded and said, "That would be Sally. She's been with us for a long time." Curious, Margaret did some research and learned about Sally White's tragic fate. She couldn't shake the feeling of sadness that lingered in the room, as if Sally's spirit was still trapped, bound to the place where she had met her end. Margaret left the hotel that day, but the experience stayed with her, a reminder that the past is never truly gone. The Menger Hotel remains a popular destination for ghost hunters and thrill seekers, many of whom hope to catch a glimpse of Sally as she continues her endless duties, a tragic figure caught between worlds. Chapter 13. The Cursed Tree of Comanche Lookout Park. Comanche Lookout Park is a serene spot in San Antonio, known for its rolling hills and panoramic views of the city. But amidst its beauty lies a dark legend centered around an ancient oak tree that stands at the park's highest point. The tree, gnarled and twisted, is said to be cursed, a remnant of a brutal past where it was used for executions during the early days of the city. Locals whisper that the spirits of those who met their end beneath its branches still haunt the tree, bound to it by the violence of their deaths. Many who have visited the park at night claim to have heard the whispers of the condemned, their voices carried on the wind. One evening, a history enthusiast named Greg decided to visit Comanche Lookout Park to explore the old trails. He had heard the stories of the cursed tree, but dismissed them as mere folklore. Armed with a flashlight and a camera, Greg set off to find the infamous oak, eager to capture its eerie beauty. As he made his way through the park, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. The park, usually filled with the sounds of nature, grew quiet, and an unnatural stillness settled over the area. Greg felt a chill in the air, but he pressed on, determined to find the tree. When he finally reached the summit, he spotted the tree immediately. It stood alone, its twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers against the darkening sky. There was something unsettling about it, something that made the hairs on the back of Greg's neck stand up. Ignoring his growing sense of unease, Greg approached the tree and began taking pictures. As he framed a shot, he noticed something strange in the viewfinder, shadows that seemed to move on their own, darting between the branches. He lowered the camera, but there was nothing there. Confused, he took another picture, and this time he saw them clearly, faces twisted in agony, staring back at him from the shadows of the tree. Panicking, Greg backed away, but the ground beneath him seemed to shift, pulling him closer to the tree. The air grew colder, and he heard faint whispers, growing louder with each passing second. The voices were angry, desperate, and they seemed to be coming from all around him. Suddenly, the whispers turned into screams, and the shadows around the tree took on human forms, spectral figures with hollow eyes and mouths twisted in silent cries of pain. They reached out to Greg, their hands passing through him like icy tendrils. He stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps, as the figures surrounded him, their expressions filled with torment and rage. In a blind panic, Greg turned and ran, the screams echoing in his ears as he fled down the hill. He didn't stop until he reached his car, his heart pounding in his chest. When he finally dared to look back, the tree stood silent, its branches swaying gently in the breeze, as if nothing had happened. Greg never returned to Comanche Lookout Park, but the images he captured that night told a different story. Blurry, distorted photos of faces hidden in the shadows, and a single shot of the cursed tree, its twisted branches silhouetted against the night sky. Chapter 14. The Ghosts of the Spanish Governor's Palace. The Spanish governor's palace, located in the heart of San Antonio, is a historic site that attracts visitors from all over the world. Built in the early 18th century, the palace has witnessed centuries of history, from the Spanish colonial period to the modern day. But with its long history comes a dark legacy, and the palace is said to be one of the most haunted places in the city. Visitors have reported strange occurrences, from cold spots and disembodied voices to the sight of shadowy figures moving through the halls. The most commonly seen ghost is that of a woman dressed in black, believed to be the spirit of a grieving widow who lost her husband during a violent uprising. One summer afternoon, a tour guide named Elena was leading a group through the palace, sharing its history and the stories of its haunted past. As they entered the main courtyard, Elena noticed a woman standing alone near the fountain, dressed in a long black gown. The woman's face was obscured by a veil, and she stood motionless, her head bowed. Thinking the woman was part of the tour, Elena approached her, intending to ask if she needed assistance. But as she drew closer, a sudden chill ran through her, and the hairs on her arms stood up. The air around the woman seemed to shimmer, and a strange, uneasy feeling settled in Elena's stomach. When she reached out to touch the woman's shoulder, that hand passed through thin air. The woman vanished before her eyes, leaving only the faint scent of roses lingering in the air. Startled, Elena gasped, drawing the attention of the tour group. One of the visitors, a man with a camera, had been snapping photos of the courtyard and rushed over to show Elena the picture he had just taken. In the photo, the woman in black was clearly visible, standing by the fountain, her veil lifted to reveal a face pale and gaunt, her eyes dark and hollow. Elena tried to continue the tour, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the encounter in her head. That night, she couldn't sleep, haunted by the memory of the ghostly woman. The next day, she returned to the palace, hoping to find some explanation for what she had seen. In the archives, Elena discovered the story of a woman who had lived in the palace during the 1800s. Her husband, a Spanish officer, had been killed in a brutal attack, and the woman had spent the rest of her life in mourning, dressed in black and wandering the palace grounds in sorrow. Elena realized that the spirit she had encountered was the grieving widow, still trapped in the palace, unable to find peace. The woman's tragic fate had bound her to the place, her sorrow etched into the very stones of the building. From that day on, Elena felt a strange connection to the woman in black, as if they shared a secret that no one else could understand. She continued to work at the palace, but she never spoke of the encounter again, fearing that the ghost might return if she did. Chapter 15. The Phantom Riders of Mission San Juan. Mission San Juan, one of the historic Spanish missions in San Antonio, is a place of quiet beauty and reflection. But at night, the mission takes on a different atmosphere, one that is steeped in mystery and the supernatural. The mission's grounds are said to be haunted by the spirits of Spanish soldiers who perished in a skirmish with Native American warriors centuries ago. According to legend, the soldiers were ambushed as they patrolled the mission's perimeter, their horses taken down in a vicious battle. The men fought bravely but were overwhelmed, and their bodies were left to rot in the fields. Their spirits, bound by the violence of their deaths, now roam the mission grounds, searching for peace that will never come. One night, a park ranger named Miguel was on duty, patrolling the mission grounds after dark. The air was still, and the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Miguel had always enjoyed the solitude of the night shift, finding comfort in the quiet beauty of the mission. As he walked along the old stone walls, Miguel heard the faint sound of horses' hooves in the distance. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but the sound grew louder, echoing off the mission walls. He turned towards the sound, expecting to see a group of riders approaching, but the path ahead was empty. Confused, Miguel continued his patrol, but the sound of hooves followed him, growing closer with each step. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the mission grounds, and the air grew thick with the smell of sweat and blood. Miguel's heart raced as he realized that he was not alone. From the shadows, a group of spectral riders emerged, their armor glinting in the moonlight. The horses' eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and the soldiers' faces were twisted in expressions of pain and anger. They rode silently, their weapons drawn, as if ready to charge into battle once more. Miguel stood frozen, unable to move as the phantom riders passed by him. The air was filled with the sound of hooves and the clinking of armor, but the riders made no sound themselves. They rode past the mission and disappeared into the night, leaving only the echo of their passage behind. Shaken, Miguel finished his patrol as quickly as possible and returned to the ranger station. He told his supervisor about the encounter, but the man simply nodded and said, "You've seen the riders. They've been here for centuries, still fighting a battle that ended long ago." Miguel never forgot the sight of the phantom riders, and he often wondered what kept them bound to the mission grounds. Were they seeking revenge, redemption, or were they simply lost, unable to find their way to the afterlife? Whatever the reason, the riders continued to haunt Mission San Juan, a reminder of the violence that had shaped San Antonio's history. Chapter 16. The Spectre of the Victoria Black Swan Inn. The Victoria Black Swan Inn, a stately mansion that once served as a Confederate hospital during the Civil War, is now a well-known bed and breakfast in San Antonio. But despite its charming exterior, the inn is reputed to be one of the most haunted places in Texas. Over the years, guests and staff alike have reported countless encounters with restless spirits, including soldiers, nurses, and even a mischievous child. One autumn evening, a young couple, Lauren and Tom, decided to stay at the inn for a weekend getaway. They were drawn to the inn's historic charm and its reputation for paranormal activity, eager to experience something out of the ordinary. Upon arrival, they were greeted by the warm, old-world ambience of the inn, but as they settled into their room, a sense of unease began to creep in. The room was beautifully furnished with antique pieces, but there was something unsettling about it. The air felt heavy, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. As night fell, the couple tried to brush off their discomfort and went to bed, but sleep did not come easily. In the middle of the night, Lauren was awakened by the sound of faint whispers. She turned over, expecting to see Tom awake, but he was sound asleep beside her. The whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent, as if they were coming from the walls themselves. Nervously, Lauren sat up and looked around the room. The shadows seemed to dance in the dim light, and she could feel a presence in the room watching her. Her heart pounded as she heard the sound of footsteps approaching the bed, slow and deliberate. The footsteps stopped just beside her, and the air grew icy cold. Lauren could barely breathe as she felt a pressure on the bed, as if someone had sat down beside her. She reached out in the darkness, her hand brushing against something cold and solid, but when she looked, there was nothing there. Terrified, she shook Tom awake, and he immediately felt the cold air and heard the whispers that now filled the room. The couple huddled together, too afraid to move, as the presence seemed to grow stronger, the whispers now a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once. Suddenly, the door to their room creaked open, and the temperature dropped even further. In the doorway stood a figure, a woman dressed in a long, tattered gown, her face pale and her eyes hollow. She stared at them for a long moment before turning and gliding down the hallway, disappearing into the darkness. The next morning, Lauren and Tom checked out of the inn, unable to shake the feeling that they had been watched all night. They later learned that the woman they had seen was believed to be the spirit of a nurse who had died of exhaustion during the war, her soul forever bound to the place where she had given her life to care for others. The Victoria Black Swan Inn remains a popular destination for those sticking a brush with the paranormal, but visitors are warned that the spirits within its walls are not always friendly. The inn's history is steeped in tragedy, and the spirits that haunt it are a reminder of the lives lost within its walls. Chapter 17. The Wailing Woman of Devil's Den. Devil's Den, a rocky outcrop on the outskirts of San Antonio, is a place that few dare to visit after dark. The area is said to be cursed, haunted by the spirit of a woman who met a tragic end on the jagged rocks. Legend has it that she was a bride, jilted at the altar, who threw herself from the cliffs in a fit of despair. Her spirit, known as the Wailing Woman, is said to roam the area, her cries echoing through the night. One summer evening, a group of friends decided to hike up to Devil's Den, curious to see if the stories were true. The sun was setting as they made their way up the rocky path, the landscape bathed in an eerie golden light. As they reached the top, the wind picked up, howling through the rocks and carrying with it a faint, mournful wail. "Do you hear that?" one of the friends, Jenny, asked, her voice trembling. The others nodded, their expressions uneasy. The wailing grew louder, filling the air with a sorrow that seemed to seep into their bones. As darkness fell, the friends huddled together, their flashlights casting long, flickering shadows on the rocks. The wind howled around them, and the wailing grew even louder until it was almost unbearable. Suddenly, the air was filled with the scent of roses, sweet but suffocating, and a thick fog began to roll in, obscuring their view. Through the fog, they saw her, a figure dressed in a tattered white gown, her long hair flowing in the wind. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow, and she moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if she were floating above the ground. The wailing woman had found them. The friends stood frozen, too terrified to move as the woman approached. Her cries grew louder, filled with a deep, aching sorrow that seemed to pierce their hearts. She reached out to them, her fingers long and bony, as if begging for help that would never come. Suddenly, one of the friends, Mark, broke free from the group and ran, his footsteps echoing through the rocks. The others followed, the woman's wails chasing them down the path. They didn't stop running until they reached their car, breathless and shaken. As they drove away, they could still hear the woman's cries in the distance, a haunting reminder of the curse that lay over Devil's Den. The friends never spoke of that night again, but they knew that the wailing woman would continue to roam the cliffs, forever mourning the life she lost. Chapter 18. The Phantom Monk of Mission Conception. Mission Conception, one of the oldest unrestored stone churches in America, stands as a testament to San Antonio's rich history. But within its ancient walls lies a story of betrayal and tragedy, a tale that has given rise to one of the city's most enduring ghost stories, the Phantom Monk. According to legend, a monk who served at the mission in the 18th century fell in love with a local woman, breaking his vows of celibacy. When his fellow monks discovered the affair, they were outraged, and the monk was exiled from the mission. Desperate and heartbroken, the monk returned to the mission one last time, seeking forgiveness. But instead, he was met with anger and violence. He was killed within the mission's walls, and his body was buried in an unmarked grave. Since that day, the spirit of the phantom monk has been seen wandering the mission grounds, his face obscured by the hood of his robe, his hands clasped in eternal prayer. Those who encounter him report a deep sense of sorrow and regret, as if the monk is still seeking the forgiveness that was denied to him in life. One evening, a historian named Emily was visiting Mission Conception, researching its history for a book she was writing. As the sun set, she found herself alone in the mission, the air growing cool as twilight descended. She was captivated by the beauty of the old stone walls, the way they seemed to glow in the fading light. As she wandered through the mission's corridors, she felt a strange sense of unease, as if she were being watched. The air grew colder, and she heard the faint sound of footsteps behind her. She turned, but no one was there. The mission was silent, the only sound the soft rustling of the wind. Undeterred, Emily continued her exploration, but the feeling of being watched persisted. She entered one of the smaller chapels, hoping to find some peace, but instead, she was met with a sudden, overwhelming sense of sorrow. The air was thick with it, pressing down on her like a physical weight. As she stood in the chapel, the temperature dropped sharply, and she saw him. A figure in a long, dark robe standing at the altar. His head was bowed, his hands clasped in prayer, and his presence filled the room with a profound sadness. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the figure slowly lifted his head. His face was hidden in shadow, but she could feel his eyes on her, filled with a deep, unspoken play. For a moment, she stood frozen, unable to move, as the monk continued to pray, his voice a soft murmur in the stillness. Suddenly, the figure faded, and the room grew warm again. The sense of sorrow lifted, but Emily was left shaken, the encounter etched into her memory. She later learned that the chapel where she had seen the monk was the same one where the legend said he had been killed. The phantom monk of Mission Conception continues to roam the mission, a silent reminder of the consequences of love and betrayal. Those who encounter him speak of the deep sadness that lingers in his presence, a sorrow that seems to transcend time, as the monk searches for the forgiveness that eluded him in life. Chapter 19. The Vanishing Hitchhiker of Interstate 10. Interstate 10, a major highway that runs through San Antonio, is known for its heavy traffic and long stretches of open road. But for years, truckers and late-night drivers have reported a chilling encounter with a vanishing hitchhiker, a ghostly figure who appears on the side of the road, only to disappear without a trace. The story goes that decades ago, A young woman was hitchhiking along I-10 when she was struck by a car. The driver, panicked and afraid, left her to die on the side of the road. Since then, her spirit has been seen wandering the highway, searching for a ride that will take her home. One rainy night, a truck driver named Jake was making his way down I-10, the road slick and treacherous. The rain fell in sheets and visibility was poor, but Jake was used to driving in bad weather. As he rounded a bend, he saw her, a young woman standing on the side of the road, her clothes drenched and her hair plastered to her face. Feeling a pang of sympathy, Jake slowed down and pulled over, rolling down his window. "Need a ride?" He called out, but the woman didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at him with wide, frightened eyes. Concerned, Jake got out of the truck and approached her, but as he reached out, she vanished. One moment she was there, and the next she was gone, leaving only the sound of the rain and the empty road behind. Shaken, Jake climbed back into his truck and drove off, but the encounter haunted him. He later learned that he was not the first to see the vanishing hitchhiker. Other drivers had reported the same thing. A young woman appearing on the side of the road, only to disappear when they tried to help. The vanishing hitchhiker remains one of San Antonio's most enduring ghost stories, a reminder that some spirits are bound to the places where they met their untimely end. The woman's restless soul continues to haunt I-10, searching for the ride that will finally take her home, but never finding peace. Chapter 20. The Haunted Hallways of the Ursuline Academy. The Ursuline Academy, a historic school for girls in San Antonio, has educated generations of students since it was founded in the 19th century. But the school's long history is also marked by tragedy, and it is said that the spirits of former students and teachers still walk its halls, unable to leave the place where they spent their lives. One of the most famous ghost stories from the academy involves a young student who died of illness in the early 1900s. Her death was sudden and unexpected, and her spirit is said to have remained at the school, wandering the halls in search of her classmates. One night, a teacher named Miss Collins was working late, grading papers in her classroom. The school was quiet, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. As she worked, she heard the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway outside her door. Thinking it was a security guard making rounds, she paid it no mind and continued grading. But the footsteps grew louder, approaching her door, and then stopped abruptly. Curious, Ms. Collins went to the door and opened it, expecting to see someone standing there, but the hallway was empty. Puzzled, she returned to her desk, but the footsteps started again, this time accompanied by the faint sound of a young girl's laughter. The sound echoed through the empty hallways, sending a chill down her spine. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the temperature in the room dropped. Miss Collins felt a cold breeze sweep through the classroom, even though the windows were closed. The laughter grew louder, more insistent, as if the girl were playing a game of hide and seek. Miss Collins stood frozen in place as she saw the shadow of a young girl pass by the door, her figure small and indistinct. The shadow paused, as if waiting for her to follow, then continued down the hallway. Gathering her courage, Miss Collins stepped out into the hallway, her footsteps echoing on the polished floor. She followed the shadow to the end of the hall, where it disappeared into one of the old classrooms. The door creaked open as she approached, and inside she saw her, a young girl in a faded school uniform, standing by the window, staring out into the night. The girl turned to look at Miss Collins, her expression sad and lost. "I'm looking for my friends," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Before Miss Collins could respond, the girl faded away, leaving the room empty and silent once more. The experience left Miss Collins shaken, but she later learned that she was not the first to see the ghost of the young student. Over the years, other teachers and students had reported similar encounters, always hearing the same laughter, the same footsteps, and seeing the same shadowy figure. The ghost of the Ursuline Academy continues to wander the halls, searching for the friends she lost so long ago. Her presence is a reminder of the school's long history and the lives that were touched, and sometimes lost, within its walls. Chapter 21. The Lurking Shadow of Street Anthony's Hotel. Street Anthony's Hotel, a grand and opulent structure in the heart of downtown San Antonio, has been a landmark of luxury since its doors first opened in 1909. But beneath its glamorous facade lies a chilling history that has left a permanent mark on the hotel, turning it into a hotbed of paranormal activity. Guests and staff alike have reported strange occurrences, from the unexplained flickering of lights to sudden cold spots and the unnerving feeling of being watched by something unseen. One of the most disturbing stories revolves around a mysterious shadow that appears in the halls, a dark figure that moves silently through the corridors, bringing with it a sense of dread that chills the very soul. One night, a business traveler named Henry checked into Street Anthony's Hotel, looking forward to a peaceful night's sleep after a long day of meetings. His room was on one of the higher floors, with a view overlooking the bustling city below. The room was spacious and elegantly decorated, but as soon as Henry entered, he felt an inexplicable unease, as though the room was hiding something sinister. Dismissing it as simple fatigue, Henry unpacked and settled in for the night. But as the hours passed, the strange feeling only grew stronger. The air seemed heavier, and shadows danced unnaturally on the walls, flickering as if alive. He tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept wandering back to the eerie sensation that something was wrong. Just after midnight, Henry decided to call it a night. As he lay in bed, trying to fall asleep, he heard a faint creaking sound outside his door, like the floorboards groaning under someone's weight. He held his breath, listening intently, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Moments later, he heard it again, this time closer, soft, deliberate footsteps that seemed to be pacing back and forth in the hallway. Curiosity getting the better of him, Henry got out of bed and opened the door, peering into the dimly lit corridor. It was empty, but the sense of unease had intensified, making his skin crawl. He stepped out into the hallway, his bare feet silent on the plush carpet, and walked a few steps in either direction, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. As he turned to go back to his room, he caught something out of the corner of his eye, a shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, moving swiftly down the hall. Henry's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the shadow slither along the wall, growing larger and more defined with each passing second. It moved with a purpose, as though it was seeking something or someone. Panicking, Henry rushed back into his room and slammed the door shut, locking it behind him. But even inside, he didn't feel safe. The shadows in his room seemed to grow darker, more oppressive, as if they were closing in on him. The temperature dropped sharply, and the sound of whispering filled the air, unintelligible but filled with malice. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into total darkness. Henry's breath came in short, ragged gasps as he fumbled for his phone, using its weak light to illuminate the room. The shadow was there, standing in the corner, its form towering and ominous. It didn't move, but Henry could feel its eyes on him, cold and unblinking. In a desperate bid to escape, Henry bolted for the door, flinging it open and sprinting down the hallway. He didn't stop until he reached the lobby, where the bright lights and the presence of other people made him feel marginally safer. Shaking, he told the night manager what had happened, but the man only nodded knowingly. "That would be the Shadow Man," the manager said quietly. "He's been here for as long as anyone can remember. We don't know who he is or was, but he's not someone you want to meet in the dark." Henry refused to return to his room, and the hotel staff accommodated his request to move to another floor. But even in the new room, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He left the hotel at first light, vowing never to return. The Shadow Man of Street Anthony's Hotel remains one of the most chilling tales in San Antonio's haunted history. A reminder that not all ghosts are content to simply haunt the places they once knew. Some, like the Shadow Man, are drawn to the darkness, feeding off the fear they instill in those unfortunate enough to cross their path. Chapter 22. The Tragic Lovers of the Spanish Steps. The Spanish Steps, a beautiful stone staircase tucked away in the heart of San Antonio, is a popular spot for romantic rendezvous and quiet reflection. But the steps are also the site of a tragic love story that has left a lingering presence, turning this peaceful place into a hotspot for ghostly activity. The story goes that many years ago, a young couple, deeply in love but from different social classes, would meet in secret at the Spanish Steps. Their love was forbidden, and they knew that if they were caught, they would be forced apart forever. But they were willing to risk everything for the chance to be together. One fateful night, as they embraced on the steps, they were discovered by the young woman's father, a wealthy and powerful man who disapproved of their relationship. In a fit of rage, he ordered his men to take the young man away, intending to have him imprisoned or worse. The young woman, desperate to be with her lover, tried to intervene, but in the chaos, she was pushed down the steps, striking her head on the stone. She died instantly, her blood staining the stones beneath her. The young man, heartbroken and enraged, escaped from his captors and returned to the steps, where he took his own life beside the body of his beloved. Since that night, the Spanish Steps have been haunted by the spirits of the tragic lovers who were seen walking hand in the moonlight, their faces etched with sorrow. One evening, a woman named Sarah was taking a late-night walk through the city, enjoying the cool breeze and the quiet streets. She had heard the story of the Spanish Steps but didn't believe in ghosts, so when she found herself near the steps, she decided to sit for a while, admiring the beauty of the old stone staircase. As she sat there, the air grew still and the sounds of the city faded away, leaving only the soft rustling of the leaves in the trees. A sense of melancholy settled over her, and she felt an inexplicable sadness that seemed to come from nowhere. Suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, Sarah saw a movement on the steps. She turned to see a young couple walking slowly down the staircase, their hands clasped together. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, the woman in a long flowing dress and the man in a simple suit. Their faces were pale and sad, and they didn't seem to notice Sarah as they passed by her. As they reached the bottom of the steps, the couple paused, and the young man turned to the woman, his expression filled with love and sorrow. He leaned in as if to kiss her, but before he could, the woman's form began to fade, disappearing into the night air. The man watched her vanish, his shoulders slumping in despair, before he too faded away, leaving the steps empty and silent once more. Sarah sat there, stunned and unable to move, her heart heavy with the sadness she had just witnessed. The encounter left her shaken, and she quickly left the steps, unable to shake the feeling that she had intruded on something deeply personal and tragic. The spirits of the tragic lovers continue to haunt the Spanish Steps, reliving their final moments together, their love strong enough to transcend even death. Those who visit the steps at night often report feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness, as if the air itself is heavy with grief. The lover's story serves as a poignant reminder that love, even in its most tragic form, can leave an indelible mark on the places we leave behind. Chapter 24. The Ghost of the San Antonio Zoo. The San Antonio Zoo, a beloved attraction for locals and tourists alike, is home to hundreds of animals from around the world. But among its many inhabitants is a ghostly figure that has been spotted wandering the grounds at night, a zookeeper who met a tragic end while caring for the animals he loved. The story goes that many years ago, a dedicated zookeeper named Charles was working late one evening when he was attacked by one of the zoo's large predators. The attack was swift and brutal, leaving Charles with injuries that he could not survive. Despite the efforts of his colleagues, he died that night, his love for the animals he cared for the only comfort in his final moments. Since his death, Charles's spirit has been seen wandering the zoo after hours, checking on the animals and ensuring that everything is as it should be. His presence is said to be comforting to the animals, who seem to respond positively when he is near, but unsettling for those who encounter him. One night, a security guard named Mike was making his rounds at the zoo, the moon casting long shadows across the empty walkways. The zoo was quiet, the animals mostly asleep, and Mike enjoyed the peace that came with the night shift. As he passed by the lion enclosure, he heard a soft, shuffling sound, as if someone was moving through the brush. Mike shone his flashlight into the enclosure, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. He continued on his way, but the sound followed him, growing louder and more distinct. It wasn't until he reached the primate house that he saw him, a man in a zookeeper's uniform, standing just outside the building, his back turned to Mike. "Hey, what are you doing here?" Mike called out, but the man didn't respond. He simply stood there, his posture relaxed, as if he were taking a break from his duties. Mike approached him, but as he got closer, the man turned and began to walk away, disappearing around the corner of the building. Confused, Mike followed, but when he rounded the corner, the man was gone. The only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant calls of the animals. Mike searched the area but found no sign of the man. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. When Mike reported the incident to his supervisor the next day, he was met with a knowing look. "That would be Charles," the supervisor said. "He's been watching over this place for years. Even after all this time, he still takes care of the animals." Mike continued to work at the zoo, but he never forgot his encounter with Charles. The ghostly zookeeper remains a comforting presence for the animals, but for those who work at the zoo, his presence is a reminder of the dedication and love that Charles had for his charges, a love so strong that not even death could keep him away. Chapter 25. The Phantom Bride of Espada Aqueduct. The Espada Aqueduct, a historic structure that once brought water to the farmlands of San Antonio, is a testament to the city's rich history. But it is also the site of a ghostly tale that has been passed down through the generations. A tale of love, loss, and a bride who never made it to her wedding day. The story goes that many years ago, a young woman named Isabella was set to marry the love of her life, a soldier stationed at the nearby mission. The couple had planned a small, intimate ceremony at the aqueduct where they had first met and fallen in love. But on the day of the wedding, tragedy struck. The soldier was killed in a skirmish, and Isabella, devastated by the news, took her own life by throwing herself into the aqueduct's waters. Since that day, the spirit of the phantom bride has been seen walking along the aqueduct, dressed in her wedding gown, her face hidden behind a veil of sorrow. Those who see her say she is searching for her lost love, hoping to reunite with him in the afterlife. One evening, a young photographer named David was exploring the Espada Aqueduct, hoping to capture its beauty in the fading light of the day. The aqueduct was quiet, the air cool and still, and David was struck by the peacefulness of the place. As he set up his camera, he noticed a figure in the distance, walking slowly along the aqueduct. At first, he thought it was another visitor, but as the figure drew closer, he saw that it was a woman dressed in a flowing white gown, her face obscured by a veil. She moved with a graceful, almost ethereal quality, as if she were floating above the ground. Curious, David snapped a few photos, hoping to capture the woman's serene beauty. But as he looked through the viewfinder, he realized that something was off. The woman's reflection didn't appear in the water below, and her figure seemed to fade at the edges, like a ghostly apparition. David lowered his camera, his heart racing, as the woman approached. She paused for a moment, her head turning as if to look at him, though he could not see her face. Then, without a word, she continued on her way, disappearing into the twilight. When David reviewed the photos later that night, he was stunned to find that the woman appeared in only one of the shots, a blurry, indistinct figure at the edge of the frame, almost as if she was slipping out of this world and into the next. The phantom bride of Espada Aqueduct continues to walk the ancient structure, her spirit bound to the place where she lost everything. Those who encounter her are left with a deep sense of sorrow, as if they have witnessed a love story that ended too soon, a love that even death could not erase.